Thank you. It's always hard to talk after Jenna, but I think some of the things that she talked about, I will talk about similar things, but more probably from the side of why is it a good idea to do some of the things that Puff and Jenna and her team are doing. And I will go through two things really in my presentation. One is talking a little bit about what is it that we are trying to work with here? What is it that we're trying to prevent? And the other part is really how can we do that in a proactive and smart way. Traditionally, this picture that you have here with risk spectrum is something that we've in the business and researchers have used a lot. But I think nowadays, looking at data, looking at all the information we have, the risk spectrum doesn't need to look like this because it really isn't this simple. Players can be at risk in many parts of this spectrum. So not just the ones that are at the very far end, red end here, may be susceptible to gambling problems, but all players can be to some extent. We really need to find ways to work with all players that engage in gambling. And as I said, players are very different from each other. They play different games. They spend different amounts of money and time. But also how gambling impacts them is quite different. So knowing what it is that we're trying to look for is sort of important. And there's a very good definition of what gambling problem is, and that's the 9 criteria here of the DSM, which is the diagnostics manual, so it's sort of the psychiatric Bible, and there's a very well-defined measure of what problem gambling is. But I'm not going to go into it because I think it's might be too theoretical to use in most cases, but some of the things that we can learn from this is that there are different levels of problem gambling. A player can have mild problems, moderate problems, severe problems, or even just occasional problems. And even though players are very different, they often have a very similar path to developing gambling problems. And they often go through from occasional overconsumption to more regular overconsumption, and then it goes into negative consequences of their gambling and eventually possibly problem gambling. So here you can see on screen some signs that we might find among problem gamblers, playing more than they would like to, having problems to stop gambling. They come back to play several times in a day. They deposit several times. And these are easily, then we can connect back to the symptoms that we had in the DSM. So for example, loss of control is quite easy to find among these signs. Coming back to play more than once, spending more money than you would like to are typical signs of loss of control. Increased tolerance, so really having to play more to get the same sense of excitement, and we can see that very clearly among the signs that we have here as well. Emotional escape, similarly. And I think looking at some of these signs, we can also look at sort of what was the traditional response when we saw signs such as these amongst players? Well, it was quite often a reactive approach, where we would wait until we saw a significant amount of warning signs before we acted. And when we did act then, it was generally too late to prevent the problems, so we had to then send the players to treatment or help restrict access to games immediately, because the player was already experiencing significant impact from their gambling. And the evidence nowadays is that that reactive approach, it didn't really work that well. So the trend today really is to work more in a proactive way. So trying to identify the signs of problem gambling as early as we can. And then, as Jenna mentioned, with their tools and segmenting of players, starting to work with players as early as we can. And the concept that is more and more being sort of put forward in the business is the concept of duty of care. So as a gambling operator or a provider of games, you have a duty to care for your customers. We're selling a potentially risky product, and we need to put up some safeguards or put some safeguards in place so that we can provide those games to your customers in a long-term safe way. And this really shifts the approach slightly from being reactive to being more proactive as a gambling operator, and offering support and help to players, not just once when they register, but really on an ongoing basis throughout their life cycle as a player. So which players do we want to communicate with and support? I realize these graphs are quite small, but I think you can see the general idea of them, that they increase very much with spending. So as a player spends more money, more time, or are more engaged in their gambling, essentially, the risk of developing problem gambling increases. But the interesting thing here is that none of these graphs really go to zero. All of them are slightly raised. And what that tells us is that there is no safe level of gambling, essentially. There is always some level of risk. Even if a player plays at moderate or low levels of spending, there are still some level of risk involved in their gambling. So this means that we probably need to show duty of care to all players, not just those that show or are high spenders. So we need to pay attention to all our customers, and we need to offer them support and help. So with that said, are there any players that are okay? Are there any players that we can say, no, this group of players, they're fine, we don't have to pay attention to them? So for instance, a player with low level of gambling disorder and spending low, can we say, this player's fine, never mind, we'll just leave them play in the way they want to? Or is a player that has spent a lot of money before, but they've come back to play and they're now playing at the reasonable level? Can we say that this player, it's probably okay? And I think what science and evidence tells us now is that there really is no player that we should consider just being okay and that we can leave alone. We need to monitor and help and support all players, even those that traditionally would be sort of flagged as being safe or normal players. So what we're really suggesting now, based on modern science and the evidence that we have available today, is that as a gambling operator, you work with all of your customers, but you adopt really a stepwise approach. So you have different methods or different communication approaches depending on the segment of the player that you're trying to communicate with at the time. So looking at the normal players, and here you can see again very small, but it's a informational paper developed in Canada, which is Low Risk Gambling Guidance. So again, going back to the slide I had previously with players where we're saying that there is no really safe level of play. There can be gambling harm even amongst players with low spending and low consumption. So really giving also the low risk gamblers some advice on how they can keep playing at a safe level, or even if they do feel harm from their gambling, how they can proactively get support and help to limit their gambling and stay healthy. So this low risk guidelines is an excellent example of educational information that you can distribute among your low risk or normal players. So really giving them advice and guidance on how to keep playing safe. But there are also other ways of working with them. And Jenna, of course, mentioned one way, which is having mandatory limits. So really having a cap on how much you can lose or how much you can spend. That's one way that you can work with even your low-risk players effectively. Different types of automated communications. And again, Jenna mentioned that well. So whenever you have triggers or you have certain behaviors that you know are risky, such as big wins, big losses, big deposits, those can be good times to communicate with the players and ask them if they are happy with the level of spending that they currently have, or if there's anything that you as a gambling operator can help them with. Different types of pop-up reminders, so reminding the player of how much money they've spent, how much time they've spent, and maybe reminding them also to occasionally take play breaks is an excellent tool for low-risk players. And finally, self-assessment tests. Self-assessment tests are an underused and underrated tool, I would say, because it's very easy for players to use. It's not you're not giving them advice that they're not asking for, but rather you're giving them advice as a response to something that they have told you as an operator, because you've asked them about what do you feel about your gambling spend or your gambling habits, and based on what the result of the self-assessment test is, you can then give them recommendations or advice how they can keep playing at a safe level. So these were sort of some of the actions that you can do when you have low-risk players. Then for the players that are at risk, so players that are spending at a slightly higher level and that are more at risk of developing problem gambling and gambling harm. So here you need to step up the level of the interventions and the interactions that you do together with the players. Reality check is one excellent method. So really asking the player, for instance, how much do you think you've spent gambling this month? And they might tell you, I think I've spent 100 euros. And then you can tell them, well, you know what, it's actually 200. And then based on that, you can then communicate with the player around, why do you think you're spending less than you actually are? And is this something that would encourage you to set a lower spend limit or change your deposit limits or something like that? And again, like for the low-risk players, automated communications are really good. So finding different patterns or events when you think that it would be a good idea to send some sort of automated information to the player, encouraging them to take breaks, set limits, and so on. And for the at-risk players, cool-down breaks are even more important because it's really easy to lose track of how much time you've been spending gambling. So encouraging players to take a break from time to time regularly is a really good tool. And the other thing that we would like to sort of look at in the future, and that's really the payment gateway feedback, because I think, or we think that gambling operators have for a long time sort of operated slightly independent of the payment providers. So the payment providers just make sure that payments go through to the operator, but they're not really involved in educating or informing the player around how much they are actually spending. So involving payment providers in the communication with the player, so the player is well aware of how much money they are in fact spending playing. Self-assessment tests, again, underrated and underused tool. And as risk increase, the usefulness of self-assessment increases as well. And what we found is that players that do self-assessment tests, they're generally quite aware of their gambling levels. They know they spend more money than they would like to. And with a self-assessment test, we can simply confirm that that is the case. You do spend more money than you would like to, and we can see that in the test. And a player that gets that confirmation is then more motivated and more susceptible to the advice and the recommendations that we can give them as a follow-up on a self-assessment test. So if we ask them to set limits when we've just concluded that they're spending more money than they would like to, they are much more likely to actually set or change their limits following that. So a self-assessment tool can be really a good way to get under their skin in a way, and get them motivated to make changes. Another thing that we've started to see more and more of, and the example you're seeing on screen here is an example from the Norwegian lottery company Norsk Tipping. So this is something that they call Spillepuls. So gambling pulse, I think, would be a good English translation, possibly. But it's a method that they've developed where they send real-time interventions to players. So on different triggers in their system, they send them a few different type of real-time intervention. This is one where they say hi, and it's just, my name is Christofer, but it's just I don't know why they've used Christofer as the name in all their examples, but so it's a coincidence. It's not me. But this is one example where they do a real-time intervention and they tell the player, you lose more on the game oddsen than 95 out of 100 players. And how does that make you feel? And then they encourage you to make a change. And in this case, what they're encouraging is really to set a lower limit. And again, this is similar to what we do with the self-assessment or a reality check, that we try to communicate with the player and show them, what does your gambling look like now? Are you happy with that, or would you like to make a change? And the good thing with the real-time interventions, and I think this is really in so many situations, not just around this, but in many situations in the world, timing is really important. So with a real-time intervention, you are really able to tap into that timing factor well. You can send an intervention when something has happened, when the player has made a deposit, or they have won, or they've lost, or they're changing games, or any other sort of game events that they might face. You can present them with an intervention and an intervention that has context connected to the event that just happened. So in that sense, the timing factor is captured in a good way. And finally, moving to the last step, which is really the high risk or problematic players. And I think this is where it really starts becoming interesting in the next level of things, which is you can't really just send off an intervention and leave it. Here you need to follow up on each interaction or each communication you do with the player, because for the high-risk players, not reaching them or not having an impact on the player, it's just really not good enough. You need to make sure that you are reaching the players, and you need to make sure that the player is responsive to the recommendations and guidance that you're giving them. So when you send something to the player, you need to follow up if the player read the message that you sent them, if they followed your advice, and possibly even if they have changed the way they play. So did they spend less time and money after the communication than they did before? And if all those things or any one of those things fail, then possibly you need to escalate the level of interaction with that player. So really going to the next step of the staircase that we have here. And at some point, if you're not able to have an impact of the player, well, then the final step is probably to have some sort of more face-to-face interaction with the player, either through email, chat, or even a phone call. Because that's really when you can really ask the player face-to-face, are you happy with the level that you're playing at? Is there something that we, as a gambling company, can help you so that you can keep playing, or to help you limit your access to gambling, either through limits or by self-exclusion? And I think this is really the peak of duty of care. So for those players that you have among your players that you are truly worried about, those are the ones that you would ideally want to find and be able to communicate with directly, so that you as a company can show that you do in fact care about them, and that you do in fact want to help them play at a safe level. So, starting to wrap up slowly, what are the challenges involved in all of this? Well, of course, trying to evaluate the effect of interactions that you do with players. Are you reaching them? Are you able to have an impact on the way they play, both in the short term, but also in the long term? Trying to find what are the best methods and approaches for your players. And if you're using a tool or a method that isn't working, then stop using it and implement something else. Avoid using the most severe level of interactions unless you have to. So looking at the stepwise approach, trying to have an impact on the players as early as possible, so as few players as possible end up at the very top level of interaction, which is essentially blocking them from play. So trying to cut down the amount of players that you really need to take the most strong actions with. And I think that's really what the image here is trying to illustrate as well. So in each level of intervention in the stepwise approach, you want the number of customers moving to the next level to be lower than in the previous step. So hopefully at the end, at the bottom of the funnel, you have as few players as possible down there. Affordability process is something that we can also talk about for hours. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but really understanding how much a player can afford to play. I think moving forward that will be really important because that's really when we know at what level gambling harm starts to develop with an individual player. These are sort of just a quick overview of what tools do we think are appropriate for the different levels. So limits is a good idea for all of the segments that we looked at. Self-test as well. Local self-exclusion, more for the yellow and red. Pop-up messages, more for the green and yellow players, not so much for the red ones. Some of the more modern tools that are available now, data analytics and player tracking systems is a good idea. Reality checks, in-play breaks, mostly good for the yellow and red. Duty of care communications, so really phone calls or chats or something face-to-face, really good for the high-risk players or problem gamblers. Capped limits and affordability checks, good for most players. Central self-exclusion for red players, and then real-time interventions is something that we feel is probably appropriate for all risk segments or all segments of players. Yeah, and just some of our thoughts on what we think should be the next steps in moving duty of care forward and responsible gambling. So I mentioned payment solutions. I think that is a good step that we need to look more at. How can we involve payment provider in helping protect customers? Sharing not just the success stories, but also sharing our negative findings or our failures in protecting customers and being more open with that. And I think what Jenna showed us, just showing how much of our revenue comes from these different segments is a good way. Not just showing that we're getting 80% from non-risk players, but not talking about the at-risk players, but being transparent about a significant amount of money do come from those groups of players as well. And finally, just evaluate. That is, if anything, let's help each other work together as researchers, suppliers, and an industry to evaluate what we do so that we can make sure that it is, in fact, doing what it should, and that is protecting and caring for our customers and for the people in our societies. Thank you.
Thank you, Christofer.
Oh,
He is, what is the most popular man's name in Sweden? Is that Christofer or no? No.
Definitely not Christofer.
Okay, so the
But
most popular gamblers are Christophers, so I didn't understand that.
That's probably the case. Most
Okay.
gamblers are called Christofer.
As you come from this Sweden, I have to say sorry about the World Hockey Championships. As you remember, on May when Latvia won in the quarterfinals. Do you know how much money the Swedish hockey fans lost in that game?
No, unfortunately.
Not
Probably a lot. Probably a lot.
A lot. Okay. Word sorry, it's one of the Justin Bieber songs is called Sorry. I remember Spotify commercial, and as we know, Spotify is founded in Sweden also. And so based on the data, Spotify made a lot of commercials. And one of those was that they put on the big banner and big commercial that one customer played 42 times Justin Bieber's song Sorry, and put it the question, what did you do?
Yes.
So about the data and gambling, do you have some also crazy stories, some crazy customer, weird things that you could make commercials about?
Oh, we probably could. But I think the most fun things, or but weird things that we see are really the misconceptions around gambling. So misunderstanding how chance works, for instance, and often, for instance, with horse betting, we see players that if they place their bet 11 minutes and 44 seconds before the race, then they will win for sure. So I think we get a lot of those crazy stories about people thinking that if they place their bet in a very specific way, standing on one leg on a Tuesday, they're going to win more. I think those are the most crazy stories that we hear.
Okay, so we will see maybe some commercials about it
Yes.
in the future. If you look on the big picture, on the biggest gambling and betting companies, how do you think how serious they approach on the responsible gaming to work with the clients?
I think looking at the biggest gambling companies, the differences are huge. They're very, very big. Typically, I think we see that the government-owned monopolies are slightly more responsible than the privately owned operators. But I think here in Latvia, I think seeing William Hill here, for instance, being one of the responsible companies in Latvia, with that said, I don't think it necessarily needs to be the government-owned companies that are doing best. I think we see examples of even, and Puff as well, but you're government-owned in a sense. But there are privately owned companies that do really well as well. And I think even the case for working with customer care and duty of care is strong because I think in the long term, you will be a more sustainable operator and you will be able to attract both customers but also employees. I don't think young people today will want to work for companies that aren't serious about being good to society in a way.
Thank you. We have some questions. Ir kādi jautājumi Christoferam?
do we have any questions to Christofer? Welcome. Jāni?
Tradition, I hope somebody follows. But what I wanted to ask you, and thank you first of all. I think it was brilliant insight and brilliant presentation. You presented a long list of tools that are active tools, communications with the players. It's a bit of a provocative question, but do you see any risks that we become so noisy with those and the communications pop up so often that it kills a little bit of the entertainment? And maybe the customers had chosen a safe gambling operator, but they can't have fun anymore there because they're constantly being told, are you okay? Do you have a problem or something like that? And then they move someplace else where it's not that safe, or some other risks like that. How would you comment on how to strike the perfect balance with all the list of these great and I think very useful tools?
That's actually a great question, and I think the simple question to your, or the simple answer is yes, of course there is that risk, but I think on the one hand, what we're seeing is that players generally, even the low risk or normal players, they generally don't mind getting information about how to play in a safe way. So promoting safe gambling isn't perceived as something bad, even for players that feel that, no, this is not for me, I don't need this. They generally don't think that getting the information about how they should do is a bad thing. But of course, there's always the level when it's too much. But by adopting a stepwise approach, you can also tune how often do you communicate. So for the low-risk players, maybe you communicate every month, every 2 months, but not very often. But as you increase the risk of the player, you also increase not just the level of intervention, but also the intensity of the messaging. So I think that's probably the approach that I would suggest, to use that as one of the parameters in the approach to provide good interventions. And then, of course, as I mentioned, timing is really important. So if a player doesn't feel like we're disturbing them, they're probably not going to feel that it's such a big problem getting messages either.
Thank you.